When people picture the fall of the Roman Empire, they usually imagine the same scene. A massive army of barbarians storming the gates, burning the marble palaces, and tearing down the statues of the emperors. It's a dramatic image. But it's mostly a myth. Rome didn't fall to invaders in a sudden, violent clash. Rome fell because it was bankrupted from the inside. It fell because of a mathematical trap that the emperors built themselves, a trap that is remarkably similar to the one your own government is running right now. Long before the barbarians arrived, the Roman state had already destroyed its own middle class, triggered a devastating real estate crash, and executed its own merchants for the crime of raising prices. They created a system where the government was so desperate for cash that it resorted to counterfeiting its own money, tricking its citizens with fake silver coins that rubbed off in their pockets. By the end of it all, the Roman economy was so broken that the government refused to accept its own currency to pay taxes. We're going to look at exactly how the greatest empire in human history spent 2 centuries destroying its own wealth. You'll see how the middle class was taxed into extinction, and why the first major bank run in history happened in the year 33 AD. Welcome to the math of imperial collapse. To understand how Rome died, you have to look at its money. Specifically, you have to look at the denarius. It was their dollar. For the first 200 years of the empire, the denarius anchored the global economy. It was a silver coin, roughly the size of a modern dime, and it was 98% pure. You could take a denarius anywhere from Britain to Egypt, and it held its value. It was the reserve currency of the ancient world. But running an empire is incredibly expensive. At its height, Rome had over 500,000 soldiers standing guard on borders stretching for thousands of miles. The military consumed between 60 and 80% of the entire state budget. And as the empire stopped expanding, the plunder from conquered nations dried up. The state had to rely entirely on taxes, and those taxes weren't enough. In the year 64 AD, Emperor Nero had a massive problem. Half of Rome had just burned to the ground in the Great Fire. He had a furious, homeless populace to deal with, and he also wanted to build himself a sprawling, wildly expensive new palace called the Golden House. But the treasury was empty, so Nero did something that would eventually doom the empire. He ordered the mint to quietly reduce the silver content of the denarius to 90%, and he made the coin slightly lighter. This was the ancient version of printing money. By melting down pure coins and mixing in cheaper metals like copper, Nero could mint 120 coins out of the silver that used to make 100. It looked like free money. The state could pay its bills without the politically dangerous move of raising taxes. But Nero had just introduced a virus into the Roman bloodstream. Once the precedent was set, every emperor who needed cash did the exact same thing. By the year 107 AD, the denarius was down to 80% silver. By 193 AD, it was down to 78%. Then came Emperor Caracalla in the year 215 AD. Caracalla needed to give the army a massive 50% pay raise to keep them from assassinating him. To pay for it, he pulled off one of the greatest financial scams in history. He introduced a brand new coin called the Antoninianus. He decreed by law that this new coin was worth 2 denarii, but he only put 1.5 denarii worth of silver inside it. It was frankly an incredibly brazen grift. An instant, state-mandated 25% theft of wealth from anyone forced to accept it. But the Roman people weren't stupid. They understood what was happening. This brings us to a concept economists call Gresham's Law, which states that bad money drives out good. When the government handed out these new, cheap coins, the citizens took one look at them and immediately hoarded their old, pure silver coins. They buried them in their yards. They hid them in their walls. They only spent the new trash currency in the markets. Because the new money was intrinsically worth less, merchants simply raised their prices. The math always wins. If a sword cost 10 pure silver coins, the blacksmith now demanded 15 of the new cheap coins to make up for the missing silver. The emperors thought they were being clever, but they had just triggered a hyperinflationary death spiral. By the middle of the 3rd century, the Roman government was essentially running a massive counterfeiting ring. They were minting coins that contained less than 5% silver. To hide this fact, They used a chemical process called depletion silvering. They dipped the copper coins in an acid bath that left a microscopic, spongy layer of pure silver on the outside. When the state handed these coins to the soldiers, they looked bright and shiny. But after a few days jingling in a pocket, the silver rubbed off, revealing the worthless copper core underneath. The soldiers, realizing they were being paid in worthless scrap metal, demanded higher pay. To afford the higher pay, the emperors had to debase the currency even further. A measure of wheat in Egypt that cost 6 drachmas in the 1st century skyrocketed to 200 drachmas by the year 276. By the year 334, that exact same measure of wheat cost 2 million drachmas. Think about what that actually means. It means a lifetime of savings couldn't buy dinner. The purchasing power of the Roman middle class simply vanished into thin air. But the destruction of the currency was a slow rot. To see the immediate panic of a financial collapse, we have to rewind slightly to the year 33 AD during the reign of Emperor Tiberius. This was the year of the world's first recorded real estate crash and credit freeze. And just like modern financial crises, it was caused by a sudden shift in government regulation. Decades earlier, Julius Caesar had passed a law requiring creditors to hold a certain percentage of their capital in Italian farmland. The law was designed to prevent capital flight and keep investment local. But for years, nobody enforced it. It was a dead law in the books. Suddenly, in 33 AD, a wave of lawsuits hit the courts accusing prominent citizens of violating the law. According to the historian Tacitus, practically the entire Roman Senate was guilty. Emperor Tiberius gave everyone an 18-month grace period to get their finances in order and buy the required land. The result was a textbook liquidity crisis. Every creditor in Rome panicked. They all called in their loans at the exact same time so they could use the cash to buy land. Debtors, suddenly forced to pay up immediately, had to sell their own properties to raise the cash. With everyone selling real estate at the same time, land prices completely collapsed. Because the land was suddenly worthless, the debtors couldn't raise enough money to pay off the loans. They defaulted. The creditors, now holding bad debt, started failing. The banking houses across the empire began to collapse. Interest rates spiked. The entire credit market froze solid. Nobody would lend money to anyone. Total gridlock. The Roman Senate tried to fix it by passing a decree that debtors only had to pay back 2/3 of what they owed. But the creditors ignored the decree and demanded the full amount anyway. The situation was dire. Prominent families were losing their rank and reputation overnight. Finally, Emperor Tiberius had to step in and execute the ancient equivalent of a bank bailout. He took 100 million sestertii from the imperial treasury and distributed it to specially chartered banks. These banks were instructed to give out 3-year, interest-free loans to anyone who could put up land worth double the loan amount as collateral. This massive injection of liquidity, what we would call quantitative easing today, finally thawed the frozen credit markets. The panic subsided, but the crisis of 33 AD proved a terrifying point. The Roman economy was no longer a simple agrarian system. It was a highly leveraged, interconnected financial web. And it was incredibly fragile. As the decades passed, that fragility was tested by the one expense the Roman state could never cut: the military. The Roman soldier didn't fight out of blind patriotism. He fought because of a strict economic contract called the sacramentum. The soldier traded his body and his years for a reliable stipend, a discharge bonus, and a plot of land. It was a transaction. When the money was good, the system worked. But when the hyperinflation hit, the system broke. Imagine you're a Roman soldier stationed on the freezing Rhine frontier. The emperor just gave you a pay raise, but because the new coins are 95% copper, the local tavern keeper just quadrupled the price of wine. You're making more money than your father ever did, but you can afford less food. When the soldiers realized their pay was effectively being cut, they did what any heavily armed labor union would do. They killed the boss. This sparked the crisis of the 3rd century, a 50-year period of absolute chaos where Rome cycled through 26 different emperors. The average reign was less than 2 years. The political system essentially became a mafia protection racket. The only way to become emperor was to bribe the army with a massive cash bonus called a donative. And the only way to stay emperor was to keep increasing their pay. It was extortion. When Emperor Septimius Severus lay dying in the year 211 AD, his final advice to his sons was simple: enrich the soldiers and despise all others. The military had become a black hole. It was a too-big-to-fail institution that consumed the entire state. The emperors were trapped in a doom loop. They had to pay the soldiers to stay alive, but they couldn't raise taxes fast enough to cover the cost, so they debased the currency, which caused more inflation, which made the soldiers demand more pay, which required more debasement. During the chaotic transitions between assassinated emperors, the administrative machinery of Rome would frequently reboot. The physical movement of money from the treasury to the frontier forts would simply stop. The soldiers were left standing on the walls, completely unpaid. And when the emperor stopped paying the soldiers, the emperor had a very serious problem. To fund these sudden, desperate pay hikes without a functioning currency, the emperors resorted to violent confiscation. They stopped trying to collect structured taxes. Instead, they just sent armed men to strip temples of gold and take crops directly from farmers, destroying the productive capacity of their own citizens. But the real death blow didn't come from the military. It came from the tax collectors. The Roman tax system didn't look like a modern IRS. It was highly decentralized. In every town and city across the empire, the local taxes were collected by a group of middle-class merchants and landowners known as the curiales. Being a member of the curiales used to be a mark of prestige. You got the best seats at the theater, and you gained social status by funding local temples and public baths. But as the empire's financial needs exploded, the imperial government changed the rules. They made the curiales personally responsible for the tax quotas of their districts. If a town was supposed to send 1,000 gold pieces to Rome, and the local citizens could only afford to pay 800, the curiales had to pay the missing 200 out of their own pockets. Suddenly, being a local official was no longer a badge of honor. It was a financial death sentence. As the economy worsened and inflation raged, the tax quotas remained brutally high. The curiales were squeezed until they broke. Many of them tried to escape. They abandoned their businesses, fled their towns, and tried to join the army or the church just to get out of their tax obligations. The imperial government panicked. They passed laws making the position of curiales hereditary. If your father was a tax collector, you were forced to be a tax collector, under penalty of death or forfeiture of all your property. The state was trying to trap its own citizens in a burning building, and the building was collapsing. The broader population faced a similar nightmare. The taxes became so oppressive that small, independent farmers simply gave up. They abandoned their ancestral lands and fled to the massive, self-sufficient country estates owned by the ultra-wealthy elite. These farmers traded their freedom for protection. They agreed to work the land for the wealthy lords, becoming tied to the soil as a class of workers known as the colony. This was the very beginning of medieval feudalism. The Roman state had taxed its productive middle class out of existence. The economy became completely top-heavy. A massive, bloated military and administrative bureaucracy was resting on the shoulders of a shrinking, impoverished tax base. In a final act of desperation in the year 301 AD, Emperor Diocletian tried to fix the hyperinflation by passing the edict on maximum prices. He literally outlawed inflation. He set strict price caps on over 1,000 items, from a pound of beef to a pair of shoes. The penalty for selling goods above the mandated price was death. You can guess exactly what happened next. Because the currency was worthless, selling goods at the government price meant taking a massive loss. So the merchants simply closed their shops. They hid their goods. The public markets emptied out overnight, and a massive black market took over. The most powerful man in the world tried to command economics by decree, and the economy simply walked away. Eventually, the situation became so absurd that the Roman government, the entity that minted the coins, refused to accept its own money as payment for taxes. They demanded that citizens pay their taxes in physical goods, grain, livestock, and leather. When a government refuses to accept its own currency, the financial system is officially dead. It's easy to look back at the Romans and think they were primitive. But the mechanisms that destroyed their economy aren't ancient history. They're the exact same mechanisms operating in the global economy today. When Emperor Nero clipped the silver off his coins to fund his government without raising taxes, he was doing exactly what modern central banks do when they engage in quantitative easing. They expand the money supply to cover deficit spending, creating inflation that acts as a hidden, silent tax on the working class. When Emperor Diocletian tried to freeze prices to stop inflation, he was using the exact same flawed logic that modern politicians use when they propose price controls on groceries or rent. It addresses the symptom while ignoring the disease, and it always results in shortages. When the Roman state became trapped by a military budget it couldn't afford to pay but couldn't afford to cut, it mirrored the modern political paralysis surrounding entitlement programs and defense spending. And when the Roman middle class was crushed by a tax burden that the ultra-wealthy elites managed to avoid, it laid the groundwork for a massive societal fracture. Rome didn't fall overnight. It was a slow, agonizing slide. It took 2.5 centuries for the currency to go from 98% pure silver to worthless scrap metal. Financial collapses are rarely sudden explosions. They're usually a slow, boring rot. I keep looking at these ancient ledgers and realizing that the math hasn't changed. It happens when a society decides it's easier to manipulate the accounting than to produce real value. When a government decides to pay for the present by stealing from the future. The Romans thought their empire was eternal. They thought their financial system was immune to the basic laws of math. They were wrong. If you want to see how modern financial systems use a different set of hidden rules to extract wealth, subscribe. Next time, we're looking at the buy, borrow, die loophole, the trick that lets the ultra-wealthy spend millions without ever earning a salary. See you in the next glitch.